All right. So in a partial equilibrium context, we saw this very important idea that the allocation created by a market is Pareto efficient. Right? That's a positive property. Now, let's review the intuition of this result a little bit more. If you have a barter economy, for example, where people are endowed with certain goods, I have two tables, you have three chairs, we may want to exchange some of our furniture. We can maybe agree on a price. So that's a barter economy. Okay, what is being traded is already there. And sometimes there may be gains from trade. I like your table a lot, and you don't, it's not particularly to your taste. Whereas you are eyeing my chairs and you like them, and I don't find them very comfortable. So there exists a profitable trade. You give up your table and take my chair. We can swap these goods. And if both parties to that transaction are better off in the process, we say there's gains from trade. Okay. Now, what a market system essentially does is that in a barter economy, it exhausts all possible gains of trade. There's no potential gains from trade which the market does not exploit, right? All such transactions are facilitated by the market. What happens in a production economy where the goods don't just fall from the sky, right? They have to be produced by firms. And that's, we saw a partial equilibrium version of that. Well, basically the role that the price system plays over there, you can think of the price as acting like a thermostat, as it were. Consumers and firms are acting entirely in their own interests. They have very narrow goals, and they're sort of self-centered goals, right? They're not in any way trying to promote a better resource allocation in society. Nevertheless, how does efficient resource allocation come about? It's because the price system sends out signals, okay? So for example, if a good is very costly to produce, right, then the market price will rise to capture that high cost of production. And that's going to send a signal to consumers that you should try and find ways of economizing on the consumption of this good in your own interest. Okay. On the other hand, if a good is highly valued by consumers, they have a lot of value out of it, right? It's vaccines in the time of a pandemic or masks and so on. Suddenly, its value has gone up significantly to consumers. So consumers convey that information through the price system. They go and increase the demand for the good that starts raising the price. And that sends a signal to the firms that this good should be produced more. And the reason for that, again, is self-interest, that there's more profits to be made in the production of this good. But that message gets conveyed through the price system. Now, let's think of the social planners problem that we talked about, okay? The result that we got is that as far as the production and consumption decisions are concerned, the social planner will end up essentially doing what the market does. Okay, so there's a certain equivalence we showed mathematically and conceptually. Now we might look at that and say, oh, then it doesn't matter whether we have a market economy or a fully planned, centralized, socialized economy. We'll get to the same outcome. Now that conclusion is not entirely warranted because when we solve the planner's problem, we made certain strong assumptions, right? How did we describe the planner's problem? The planner was trying to maximize the social pie, so to speak, social cake, and that was the sum of utilities minus the sum of costs. Okay. Now, implicit in that formulation is the idea that the planner knows each consumer's utility function and each firm's cost function. Now, that's in the real world, that's an absurd informational requirement. The problem in a socialist system with central planning is that this kind of fine-grained information is not available to the planners. The planners may be very well-meaning, they may try very hard to bring about the right allocation, but in a large, modern, complex economy with millions of people, they don't have information about utility functions and cost functions. That's fair to say. So the planner's problem that we solved was really a theoretical benchmark, an upper bound on what the planner may be able to achieve in terms of efficiency. And that upper bound matched what the market brings about. Okay. In reality, the planner is probably going to fall far short because of missing information about utilities and costs. So based on those grounds, you could say that there is actually a strict advantage to market-based allocations, not planned allocations. Okay, and that advantage is informational. That advantage wasn't captured in the math exercise that we did, but if you think about it for a moment, it's there. Okay, the planner will be able to match the market only if the planner has a very high level of information, otherwise fall short. One of the great advantages of the market-based allocation is that there's no strong informational requirement. All consumers need to know is their own utility function. And from that, they can create their own demand functions and go and buy the good. All firms need to know is their own cost functions. The price system takes care of the rest. It does not require anybody to know more than what they can reasonably be expected to know. Okay, it's a decentralized mechanism which aggregates all the information which is out there among consumers and firms and puts it together in reaching an efficient allocation. Let's think about taxation. So the way we have looked at markets so far is that they're completely, literally free markets in the sense there's no intervention by the government. The government doesn't put any regulation whatsoever on the market. There are no taxes, there are no subsidies, there are no price controls, price floors or ceilings, there are no quantity quotas. All of that was assumed away. So now what happens if we start bringing in some of these policy interventions? How does the market respond to that? What happens to welfare? So first, let's talk about taxation. Okay, let's take an excise tax, a quantity-based tax, right? The tax base is how much is bought and sold. We saw earlier that we don't have to worry about whether the tax is on the buyers or the sellers, same outcome. So let's, to make a choice, let's put the tax, we'll put the tax on sellers. Okay, this is the pre-tax situation. P0, Q0 are the quantities, the equilibrium price and quantity. As we discussed before, the measure of welfare for consumers is this triangle. This is the consumer surplus. The measure for producers is this triangle, producer surplus. So area under the demand curve and area above the supply curve, which is also the marginal cost curve. So the social surplus is the sum of consumers and producer surplus. So it's the sum of these two areas. Okay, so now there's, suppose, a tax placed on sellers. So obviously this will affect the supply curve, and you can easily see that it'll move up by the amount of the tax. Okay, because that part of what sellers are getting is lost in tax payments for them. So our new equilibrium is this point, the new intersection of demand and supply. That gives rise to this quantity. We have written it as a function of T. Of course, it'll depend on the size of this tax. And now there's a wedge between the net price which buyers have to pay and the net price which sellers receive, and those are marked by these two things. Now, in this new post-tax situation, let's try to measure the welfare of all the parties and then add it up to get a social surplus measure. What's the overall surplus for society as a whole? First of all, consumers. What is the consumer surplus? As usual, consumer surplus will be the area under the demand curve and above the price line, the price being the price relevant to consumers, and that's this price, PB. And so I can color that blue. That's the consumer surplus now. How much is producer surplus? Well, area above the supply curve, below the price which is relevant to sellers, and that's our red area. Now, at this point, you may scratch your head that, okay, is that all? Is that all the consumer surplus? Sorry, is that all there is to social surplus? Well, no, there's a third item we've missed. All right, and that's the revenue collected by the government. That's not a waste. Maybe the government can spend that on things that we value, like build a bridge or a road or extend railway lines or what have you. Okay, so let's count that. Let's not count it as a loss to society as a whole, right? We now have three entities: consumers, producers or sellers, and the government. And the government is whatever the revenue collection is spent on the welfare of citizens. So that's the green area. The government's revenue collection is the tax per unit of sale times the number of units that is being sold on the market. So the price per unit is this height, and the quantity is just this part. So that rectangle captures tax revenue. But now, if we compare with the previous situation, the situation that prevailed before the tax, we see that these three things have not quite added up to what we had before as social surplus. What we had before as social surplus, if you remember, was this entire big triangle, right? And now we are left with only a part of it, which is the colored part. And so the part that has gone missing is this small triangle, this black area. So this is what is called deadweight loss. The idea is that if a tax is imposed on a good, it creates a net loss for society as far as that good and that market is concerned. Now, we have to be careful about understanding this concept. Okay, so let me say a little bit more. Does this imply, when this analysis tells us that taxes create deadweight losses, does that mean all taxes are bad and ought to be avoided? Of course not. What this says is something like this. Suppose for some reason the government wants to raise 100 rupees in taxes. There's a project, okay, a new railway line will be built and it's going to cost 100 rupees. So the cost that those 100 rupees have to be raised through taxes. And suppose we are trying to do cost benefit analysis. Is this railway line worth building? Now, of course, there's benefits to building this railway line and costs. So we look at the benefits, we estimate the benefits somehow. Let's not get into the details of that. Say there are surveys of citizens and each citizen's some monetary equivalent value of the railway line is assessed, and that is all added up. And we have found that, let's say, the overall value will be 100, for everyone combined, is going to be 120 rupees. And then you might make an argument to the government as an advisor or an advocate that, hey, this project is worthwhile because its cost is 100 rupees and its cumulative value to all citizens is 120, which is more than the cost. That's where the concept of deadweight loss comes in. Okay, so a good economist will point out that, look, 100 rupees is the face value of the cost. That's the cost which has to be explicitly paid. But since the cost has to be raised through taxes on certain goods and services, whatever the taxes are levied on will create deadweight losses. So the effective cost to society is not just the explicit cost, the 100 rupees, but also the size of the deadweight loss. So let's estimate that. After estimating it, in principle, kind of estimating this area econometrically or with data, what have you, you find that the deadweight loss from collecting the 100 rupees in taxes is 30 rupees. So now the total cost ought to be seen as 130 rupees, and that's more than the 120 rupees in value to citizens if the railway line is built. So now it's not worthwhile. So here's an example, a simple example with a few numbers I'm throwing out, which shows that if we are not aware of the notion of deadweight loss, our cost-benefit analysis may give us the wrong answer. In the same situation, if we estimated the deadweight loss to be only 10 rupees, right, then even after accounting for it, we'll have a total cost of 110 and the value is 120. In that case, the railway line would be worth building. Okay, so the entire upshot is not that all kind of taxes have to be avoided like the plague. It's just to make us aware that there's an extra subtle hidden cost associated with taxes, which is the deadweight loss, and that has to be stacked to the explicit cost of a project. Now, for subsidies, it's the same thing. Okay, how does the picture change? If we have subsidies, instead of the supply curve shifting up, it shifts down, and the quantity increases instead of decreasing. Okay, but you'll have a deadweight loss in the other side. Essentially, there'll be overproduction because of the subsidy. So subsidies also, like taxes, have this distortionary effect. It takes us away from the efficient quantity level in the market. The actual production either goes above that or below that, as the case may be. Now, you can think of other kinds of policy interventions. For example, there can be a price ceiling. Instead of a taxes, the government just tries to regulate the price. For example, something like rent control. In some cities, there may be municipal or state or central laws which say that rents are not allowed to rise above a certain level for a certain kind of housing. And if the price ceiling is below the equilibrium price, then we have this situation. The market doesn't clear. There's a shortage. This is labeled wrong. This should be QD. This should be QS. So there's an excess demand because the price is held artificially low. But more importantly, if the ceiling is effective, then that means that the quantity is the lower of these two, okay, the quantity which is actually served. And then there's the same deadweight loss that we saw in the earlier picture. This kind of triangle appears as a deadweight loss. Okay. More intuitively, what's the problem that arises with, for example, rent controls? Because of the artificially low rents, well, first of all, there may be more tenants on the market because it's the official price is cheap. But more importantly, there may be some reduction in supply. Okay, some people who would have rented takes their apartments or houses off the market, and so the supply falls, and it starts creating a shortage. We can have exactly the opposite with price floors. A prime example of price floor is minimum wage laws. So there, the equilibrium market clearing price or wage would have been lower, but it's held artificially high And then there's an excess supply situation captured by this gap, this horizontal gap between the demand and supply curve at the price floor. And that again creates the deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss really is calculated based on what is the quantity that comes about. The efficient quantity is at the intersection of the two curves, the Q star. And for whatever reason, whatever policy intervention, if the actual quantity falls short of that, then this deadweight loss will arise. Does this mean that a minimum wage law is bad? We should always strongly advocate against it? Yes, Anand.
Sir, I have this question exactly on the topic because once I was reading, then I also thought that minimum wages are not efficient way of achieving the same objective, whereas providing subsidies, wage subsidies, are a better way. Then why is the minimum wage policy are more popular even in US or in India than say wage subsidy? For India, I can understand that India is a poor country relatively, but for richer countries, why is that minimum wage is a more voted option or more chosen option?
Okay, so let's take one thing at a time. Okay, so you raise a further question that maybe some sort of intervention is needed, but to raise the wage, but it could be wage subsidies instead of minimum wage laws. But let's just compare no intervention with a minimum wage. Let's just, for now, let's just stick to that. Okay. So as far as that comparison is concerned, we have this point that, a minimum wage law will create this deadweight loss. So what? Aditi, let me quickly take one or two questions.
So not a question, sort of like an answer. Maybe we can take the example of the farm laws only. So like they were in favor of the MSP, right? So that's essentially a price ceiling. And maybe that's needed because that particular market, the agricultural market, is maybe, at least in India, which is still, an agrarian economy, is not ready to take the brunt of, perfect competition. Like farmers were scared that these big corporations will come in and, they'll, like the price that they will receive will be much lower than the cost that they are incurring, to grow the crops and all. So I guess overall for the welfare of that particular sector, these sort of interventions are needed, even if there is a deadweight loss to society and government.
So there are various questions bundled in here. Okay, one is what is the welfare effect of this intervention? Does it actually help the people that they are intended to help? Right. So some price regulation in the agricultural market, does it actually help farmers? So we have to engage in that discussion. Okay, sort of delve into the reasoning. What might be the effect of this? Sometimes we have policies which have unintended consequences. Right? They are well-meaning, but they may end up hurting the people that they're supposed to help. That's a possibility that sometimes can happen. So we have to understand what the impact of the policy will be on various groups. In the case of minimum wage laws, people have argued that, look, since you're raising this, you are creating a loss of jobs, and that's a very big factor. If the demand curve for labor is downward sloping, and the cost of hiring goes up, then along the demand curve, as you move along, fewer jobs will be available. And that has been the basis of the argument that the policy may be seen as self-defeating, that it's intended to help workers, but some workers lose their jobs because of the policy. That is a counter argument. Okay. Now, the question to ask there is that, okay, this deadweight loss is this aggregate kind of measure. Okay. Are all workers better off if you pass a minimum wage, or are all workers worse off? Or can we do a Pareto comparison among workers due to the minimum wage?
So the workers who will still have their jobs after the minimum wage law are the ones who will be better off.
Yes, there's a bifurcation, right? we cannot do a Pareto comparison because those who manage to hold on to their jobs get a higher wage, so they're better off, they're happy. But because of the market reaction and the excess supply and the unemployment which crops up, some of the workers are worse off. So then the question would be that, if we raise the minimum wage, let's say 20% or 30%, what are the sizes of these groups? What fraction of the workforce manage to retain their job and enjoy the higher wages, and what fraction loses out by getting unemployed? That number will, of course, if it turns out that this creates 10% unemployment, that's very big. We have to worry about such a large number of people losing their jobs. But if it creates 0.1% rise in unemployment, still 99.9% of the workers are better off. And we may want to accept that. We may, want to say that that's a good thing. So that number becomes very important. And then what property of the demand supply curves are important as far as that number is concerned?
So slopes, relative slopes.
Elasticity of supply and demand.
Yes. Imagine that for whatever reason, and some of you were making a case for that, I think, in yesterday's lecture. For whatever reason, let's say if the labor demand curve is vertical, right? Then a minimum wage law will not reduce jobs whatsoever if demand elasticity is very low. Now, there are actually, in the American case, the last Nobel Prize went to, among others, David Card. And one of the famous studies of David Card and his co-authors showed that in certain cases, in certain states in America, when the minimum wage was raised, employment was hardly affected, right? So the employment elasticity was very low, at least for those kinds of jobs and those kind of wage levels. So the labor demand curve seemed to be close to vertical, which informed a lot of the policy debate about this. Okay, but that's, as economists, that's the kind of thing on which we would like to know what the data is.
Sir, I guess that jobs were about retail stores and unskilled jobs, so it was not all encompassing of all the jobs that were in the market.
Of course. So, I mean, raising of the minimum wage is only relevant to a section of the labor market, right? It doesn't affect college professors and Wall Street, investment bankers. So that's irrelevant for them. But we are only talking about, people working in burger shops. Vikash?
Yes, sir. And I wanted to say also, if we want to reduce the deadweight loss due to minimum wage, we can also accompany it by increasing the demand for job,
Yes. So somebody else mentioned wage subsidies. Right. So that's the second question. Okay. So one objection you might, if you want to oppose the minimum wage law, one objection is, the employment effects of it. But an alternative objection could be that, look, I accept your goal, but not your means. I acknowledge that market wages are too low and the equilibrium is not giving a fair deal to most workers, and we would it's a desirable social goal to try to boost their incomes and their earnings, but there may be a better way of doing it, maybe a wage subsidy, maybe a direct benefit transfer, and so on. Okay, let me come to the question of alternatives in a little while. So here we are just comparing putting a minimum wage law in place versus doing nothing. Okay, Rishi?
Sir, if we just think about just one firm, if the workers who were able to retain their jobs actually now become the demanders of the product as well, wouldn't that lead to efficiency in the end?
If there's only one firm.
Yeah, and suppose that the product that the firm was making, it's a bit pricey and the laborers are not using or using a different alternative. But now since the minimum wage is there and it's a higher wage than the equilibrium wage.
Yeah, I mean, what the point you're making goes back to something, among others, in the development literature, people have talked about it. And there's a famous discussion about the shoe factory. So if a firm hires more people or pays better wages to its workers, some of that will come back as a positive thing for the firm because the workers may buy some of the firm's own products. So if it's a shoe factory and they raise their wages, some of that extra wage will be spent on shoes, so their sales will go up. But it's certainly not going to be 100%, right? If they, whatever raise they give their workers, they won't spend all of it on the shoes. And so the net benefit of raising wages is certainly going to be negative.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Aishwarya.
On the downside of Rishi's argument, we could also say that the firm is giving higher wages by compensating it and charging a higher price. So we go back to the wage price spiral where the wages are rising because of the minimum wage, but at the same time, the price of the commodity is also rising because the cost is higher. So in that case, that benefit is neutralized.
No, but we're not compromising on wages by increasing prices. We're compromising on wages by like firing off certain people, laying off people. So we don't need to increase the price necessarily, I think.
Remember, we are talking of a framework of perfect competition. Yes. Where firms do not have market power and they cannot influence the prices in any market.
Yes, but Rishi's argument was there is only one firm, so that's why I gave this downside. Like he specified.
There are two things. Right now this framework of discussion is restrictive in two ways. First of all, we are taking perfect competition and price taking behavior, and other than that, we are doing partial equilibrium analysis. So you're right. Everything, once you go to general equilibrium and allow all prices to be flexible, there will be impacts on other markets, and that has to be taken into account. And that's the point that you guys are talking about, that maybe minimum wage laws have, it ripples through the economic system, affecting all kinds of prices, and who's to say that, the price of the firm's product is not affected. There's no beneficial, maybe there will be a beneficial impact on the prices. Now, if we are talking of the labor market in general, not just for a specific commodity, then that argument is very hard to make even theoretically, right? And even going to general equilibrium. Yes. We're talking of a cumulative market for all kinds of labor. But anyway, to do any kind of detailed analysis of that, we need a general equilibrium framework, which we don't have right now. But let me just say summarily that it'll be very rarely the case that increasing the nominal wage leads to a drop in the real wage. Essentially, the effect that you're talking about will only arise if an increase. It may have some negative feedback effect, right? So if you increase the nominal wage by 10%, you may have general price inflation of 3%, 4%. Okay, so the real wage increase may be not as much as the nominal wage increase, but rarely will it reverse the thing. That usually requires a system where the equilibrium is unstable. You nudge it a little bit and moves completely away. Anyway, I can't thoroughly discuss that point, right? But it's very unlikely to happen.
So if the minimum wages, increased and the firms lay off some workers in order to minimize their cost, doesn't it mean that there was inefficiency in the firm in the first place, kind of a disguised unemployment?
No, why? Why? And what's wrong with this picture? Before the minimum wage law, this is the intersection. What was inefficient over there?
No, I mean the firms earlier, before the rise in the minimum wages, they could have done their work with, lesser workers, but there were more workers then than now.
But if the firm is a profit maximizer, right? Let's buy into that assumption that the firm is a strict profit maximizer. So if it removes the inefficiency, its profits go up. So why would a profit maximizing firm tolerate such inefficiency and would need a perverse kind of pressure of higher wages to remove the inefficiency? Right?
Sir, I want to add something like instead of
Hang
saying
on,
that
one second. Let me just finish this, right? So who was asking? It's a good question, right? Maybe there was some slack in the operation of the firm. Maybe people were not assigned to the right jobs. The managers were just not paying enough attention. And now that they have to pay these extra wages, it starts pinching, profit margins go down. So they wake up and start, removing all the inefficiency within the firm's work culture and work organization. Now, they could have done that before a minimum wage law forced them to pay higher wages. They could have done that before, but didn't. Okay, so now that may be true in the real world, but then firms are not being profit maximizers. So we cannot capture the effect that you're talking about in a framework where we assume profit maximizing firms.
Okay, sir, got it.
Yeah. Again, empirically maybe what you're saying, but then our overarching assumption of profit maximization has to be abandoned.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. Now, there are, I think, what is going maybe across some of your minds. Let me just very briefly sort of give you a teaser. If you look at development economics, there are ideas there. For example, there's a paper by Debraj Ray and Partha Dasgupta called Nutrition-Based Efficiency Wages from the Economic Journal. What's the basic idea there? The basic idea is that, if workers get better wages, they eat better. Think of a very poor country. People are on the brink of subsistence. So their productivity is low because their wages are low and they remain malnourished. Right? That in turn justifies the low wages. So you can get trapped into a low level equilibrium trap, so to speak. Workers are not very productive, so employers pay them low wages, and because the wages are low, they don't get to eat nutritious food in enough quantities, and that's what keeps them sick or unhealthy and lacking in strength and less productive. So it becomes like a vicious cycle. In principle, there could be a much better equilibrium where their wages are higher and because of better nourishment, they are more productive, and then those higher wages are justified by their marginal product. Even a free market would tolerate those higher wages if we can get to that situation, right? So that kind of framework gives rise to multiple equilibria, and there you might make an argument that so imagine what happens there is that there's more than one intersection of demand and supply curves, essentially. And then to move the whole system from a lower inferior equilibrium to a higher, better equilibrium, some kind of nudge may be needed. And their minimum wage laws may play that role. There's also work by Kaushik Basu on child labor, right, which makes an argument with policy implications along similar lines. Let me not make too many digressions in the main course of the lecture. I'll throw out some of these ideas, which is beyond the syllabus, so to speak, so that those of you who are interested can bounce it around. We have a discussion segment in Canvas, which I haven't explored yet. So maybe I'll float some of these ideas and generate discussion through that forum, right? But the general direction in which some of you are trying to pull me is quite a valid one. Ronak?
Yes, sir. So my question is, what if we take into account the rise in population or any other factor that leads to a shift in demand to the right?
Well,
in
this
this
is
case,
let's not veer too far off course. Okay, so we are talking of a particular policy, right? Many other things, of course, will go on in the world. One of the things of this sort of theoretical approach is that we can discipline our thinking, think about one thing at a time, right? So with stable demand and supply, if the minimum wage is raised, what happens? Okay, now quotas will have the same kind of effects. Quotas, by force, you are reducing the quantity below market clearing levels. Okay. Now, somebody mentioned MSP, so let me talk about that. It's not on the slides, but okay, let's talk about MSP a little bit. Now, what exactly? Of course, the whole system that we have of MSP and then procurement by the government of large quantities of wheat and rice, and then some of it is provided at highly subsidized rates, almost free to poorer households through the PDS. So it's a whole web of policies, right? So it's a very complex system. There's multiple objectives of this sort of MSP policy too. One of the original objectives was price stabilization, right? Agricultural supply is notoriously subject to weather shocks. In good years, we have a bumper crop. In bad years, when there's drought or flood, the crop is affected. So the price moves around a lot. Okay, and both consumers as well as sellers may want a more stable price, right, where the variance is less from season to season. And one way to do that is for the government to buy up, in years of glut of extra production, hold it in stock, and then in years of underproduction, kind of release those stocks, and that'll stabilize prices, because as the supply curve is moving around, you're also moving, you're doing a sort of counter-cyclical adjustment of supply through government stocks and through government purchases. But there are other possible objectives. Part of the objective is also procurement, because through the PDS, the government has to provide a lot of rice and wheat to poorer households. You can also imagine a third objective, which is to kind of shift the so-called terms of trade in favor of farmers, right? Effectively giving farmers better prices so that there's a boost to their incomes. Now, let's try to understand in a very stylized way. As I said, there are many, many details and complexities, but in a sort of simple summary of what the gist, or at least part of the features of our MSP policy is that this price, this quantity, there's a market for wheat, let's say, and there's a demand curve, there's a supply curve, and this is the equilibrium market price, so there's a free market price, and it's felt that this price is too low, farmers are not making much money, they have poor living standards, it's desirable to raise this. How does this approach do it? Suppose we want to raise it to this level. Now, you could put a price floor, which this is the legal price of wheat has to be at least 50 rupees, right? Any sale at a price below that is illegal. If that could be enforced, okay, farmers will get that, but there will be severe quantity effects, right? I mean, at that price, even if it's perfectly enforceable, there'll be this excess supply. A lot of what farmers want to sell is they won't be able to sell. That's one thing. The other thing is that, it's very hard to enforce. Agricultural markets are in every nook and cranny of the country, right? Everywhere there's a bazaar, there's a mandi. It's, in practical terms, it's impossible to keep a watch on the prices everywhere in the private market. Okay, so it's hopeless as far as enforcement is concerned. So in a stylized way of putting it, what is the policy then of trying to maintain a higher than market clearing price? Essentially, this is set as MSP, and this excess supply is soaked up through government procurement. The government has to, whatever this amount is, X, essentially at the announced MSP, the government has to buy up this amount to make the MSP effective, right? And that means that the supply curve is shifted to the right, to the left. This is the shift of the supply curve that is needed to bring about this higher price. So what happens to this excess? This excess is essentially goes into FCI go downs, right? So the government has to lift this from the market and store it away. Or if you want to be dramatic about it, dump it in the seas. If it disappears into a go down and never comes up, then that's as good as destroying it, right? Now, what is the deadweight loss of this policy? So now the quantity will be Q bar, the quantity consumed by consumers, but actual production will be, so this is, let's say, Q bar for buyers, this is Q bar for sellers, and the difference is essentially stored away. So what is the deadweight loss? How do I find it?
So this particular rectangle area.
The triangle below X, half into X into P bar minus P star.
This triangle?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Well, that's certainly a candidate, or at least a component, because ideally it should have been Q star, and now the actual consumption has fallen here. And if it was just a price minimum, if it was just an enforced price floor, this red area would have been the deadweight loss. But we are not talking of a price floor. We are talking of manipulating prices upwards by lifting some of the supply and taking it off the market. So if that is the manner in which this high price is brought about, then there'll be an additional component to deadweight loss, which is what?
Parallelogram type of thing, like left of red portion also.
So below the red part and the right of red part.
Okay, so let me show it to you and then give the argument why that is. So we'll have to take all of this. Basically we have to. This green area is what? This green area is the cost of production of the excess production, which is lifted off the market, right? Now, if you think about that part, so what's the difference? What's the difference between this price achieved through a price floor versus through this sort of market-based intervention? Well, if it were a priced floor, we would just have, ideal quantities Q star, actual quantity produced and consumed would be Q bar. And the red area we know is our familiar deadweight loss. Now, the difference for this policy is that although consumption is this lower amount, production is actually higher. So the only difference comes from this excess production. So what is the net social value of the excess production? Of course, it's negative, right? There's a cost of producing it, but nobody gets to consume it. So there's no consumer benefit for this amount of excess production. And so the cost of producing it is this green area, right? Area under the marginal cost curve, which is also the supply curve. So this is all the cost of producing all this extra amount, which nobody is eating. And that has to be added to the usual deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss under this policy is the sum of these two. Yes. Now the question would arise then that why don't we try to, just put a price floor and ban all trades below this price? Well, as I said, it's impossible to enforce. And in any case, farmers will also, in that case, be limited to selling this amount as opposed to this higher amount. Okay, so if a price floor were imposed, like with rent control, yes, farmers are getting better prices, but they're selling less. That's a second kind of effect, right? Shubham?
Sir, when we are giving MSP to the farmers, sir, the actual data says very small proportions of the farmers are actually selling at MSP, right?
No, actually, it's highly concentrated in region and crops, but
in
it's not
certain
small,
states.
but it's not a small fraction. So for, I think, wheat and rice, it's roughly 1/3 of the national level production, if I remember, right? Around something around that, 30% or so. But it's heavily procured from a few states, Punjab, Haryana, I think Andhra has probably become important, or MP, I forget. But Punjab, Haryana are the leading ones. And it's also most effective for rice and wheat, and procurement for other crops is very little.
Sir, also just want to clarify, sir, I was reading somewhere that only the larger farmers get the MSP and the small farmers, they sell to the larger farmers.
See, this is a thing which, I mean, if markets didn't have too much friction, right, then the beneficiaries of MSP will not just be those farmers who are able to sell to the government at the MSP. The effect should spill over to other farmers too, because of MSP in the open market, like in this picture, supply is shifted to the left. And so the farmer doesn't necessarily have to literally sell through MSP, right? The MS3 should also pull up the open market price. Now, in reality, of course, there are all kinds of frictions, right? So this doesn't happen perfectly. This picture assumes it is the case that we have one integrated frictionless grain market. That is not the case, so there are complications arising from that. But it would be, I think, wrong to swing to the other extreme and say that it's completely fragmented submarkets, that those who don't sell at MSP don't benefit at all. That is not true.
Okay. And sir, what happens to the extra buffer stock which the government keeps?
That's a long story. See, it's a dynamic market, right? So on the face of it, a lot of that procurement goes back through the PDS. Yes. But if you systematically want to keep prices above market prices, then you have to systematically over procure, which is not to say that all the procurement is stored away and eaten by rats. But if you're systematically over procuring more than what the PDS needs or the midday meals need, then you're letting it accumulate, and so it's disappearing into a rabbit hole, some part of it.
Okay, sir, thank you.
Nitya?
Sir, in the scenario where MSP is placed and the government buys off the extra buffer stock, so the excess supply is vanished away. So then why do we have the situation of deadweight loss in this case?
Deadweight loss is because partly, if to the extent, if MSP drives up the market price, yes, then on the consumer side, consumption falls, and it falls below the efficient level. So that's creating the red area of the deadweight loss, and that's standard.
Yes, sir. Sir, but what is like the intuitive reasoning behind this? Because it's like just simply the excess, the supply is simply reduced. Like
basically supply shifted backwards, and we can assume that it's for any reason. So
no, it's not for any reason. It's because, I mean, if the MSP is to have any teeth, it has to be backed up by government procurement. And so the supply is shifting to the left because the government is lifting some of the production and taking it away from the market, right? Now, this is, as I said, this is a very simple analysis. As I respond to one of the questions, I said that, I'm assuming away all frictions. In that kind of world, MSP and the open market price, even non-MSP transactions. Now, in reality, that is not the case. But anyway, I mean, this is as a starting point of the analysis, right? In reality, MSP will have an upward effect on open market prices to some extent, at least. Okay, let me again. I'm almost out of time, and it's very slow progress. So I appreciate all the questions. Let me hold them off just for a moment and put in a few more points. And then I'll be happy to take your questions. Now, let me make one sort of last important point here. I thought I'll get into these externalities problem of goods today, but I couldn't. So I really have to speed up at some point. Okay, let's get to the issue that was touched upon by some of your questions earlier. All right, we want to help farmers, we want to help workers, we want to help poor people living in rented apartments, and we are considering all kinds of policies, including, subsidies, price controls, etc., etc. And our analysis is showing that all these things, all these interventions in markets involve deadweight losses, which means that, if we sum up everyone's economic benefit, all parties, then some amount is lost. Even if you manage to help workers to the tune of, let's say, 10,000 crore rupees, the loss to other market participants, maybe consumers, will be more than the 10,000 crore rupees. It will be maybe 12,000 crore rupees. So the 2,000 extra will be a deadweight loss. Okay. So is there any alternative way of helping farmers, workers, tenants through other policy instruments? Yes, that's the question. Now, what is the answer to that? What does our little demand supply model and what we have studied, does it tell us something about what's the best way to redistribute income and to benefit groups that we want to help? What's the best policy instrument? So let's go back to our little simple model of a one good partial equilibrium system. So the market for bread. And we are worried about consumers. Consumers are paying very high prices and they're getting to eat very little bread. And these bakeries are owned by rich people. They're making a lot of money. We don't like this. So we may want to subsidize bread for consumers and tax the bakery owners.
Sir, is it cash transfers?
Yes. So let's build that up from the model. What does it mean to say that, these quantities should be left untouched? As we were discussing in yesterday's lecture, we were not saying that the social planner should do nothing. The utilitarian social planner didn't care, how the cake was divided. Other more general social planners did, and they may not be happy with the market outcome. But what was the upshot of all that discussion? The upshot was that, bring in this bleeding heart, egalitarian social planner who's shedding tears for the consumers and is really angry that these rich bakeries are making so much profits. But the best manner of trying to change that situation is to leave the quantities unaffected, but to change around those TI and the SJs, the monetary component. Now, the way the TIs and the SJs have been defined, they're defined as flat payments to or from agents. Those are payments which are independent of how much they choose to consume or supply. So essentially, that tells us that the best form of intervention or trying to change the income distribution or to come to the aid of certain groups is flat taxes, which may include negative taxes, because then you are not affecting the market decisions. And so the quantities will remain at efficient levels. Lump sum taxes and transfers. That's the theoretically ideal solution. And in the practical world, what that would mean is, for example, in the case of farm, you might want to take the position, and this has been part of the debate, in the actual public debate, which is that instead of trying to, subsidize fertilizers and impose high MSPs, why don't we put money into farmers' bank accounts, direct benefit transfers, make lump sum benefit? Theoretically, that's the right solution. And this is true for all the web of subsidies that we have. We have subsidies for water, subsidies for electricity. What's the problem, going beyond the math and the diagram? The problem is that if water is subsidized, electricity is subsidized, there's overuse. So water tables fall, we have environmental problems, electricity consumption is too high, and then that creates pollution and all these associated problems and so on. So there is a solution that get rid of these subsidies or these attempts to manipulate prices, and just put money into people's accounts. Now, will that solve all our problems in the real world right now in India? So the big problem is, on paper we may want to do that, but in practice, to make sure that everybody who's deserving is identified and get the money paid to them is very hard. So if you change the crop prices and raise prices of wheat and rice, anybody who sells wheat and rice is automatically benefited. You don't have to find all of them administratively. But if you have to give out money, you have to identify all the people that you want to benefit. You have to get the bank accounts. You have to have a huge database. Now, in many advanced economies, that is possible, right? Most people are in the tax system. More than 90% of the people are in the tax system. The government has information about their annual income from their tax filings. In India, the farm sector is exempt from income taxes. 7% or thereabouts of the adult population actually filed for taxes. So most people, the government has no information about most people's incomes, their economic conditions, their bank accounts, and so on. And that's the problem of switching to this method. Which is not to say that we shouldn't try, or we shouldn't try to substitute some of the distortionary redistributive policies that we have involving subsidies and campaigns. But that we should be aware, we shouldn't sort of jump from the textbook right into the world with gung-ho enthusiasm and say, okay, from tomorrow, all we'll do is DBT. Okay, it's a long, arduous task, even if you want to do that transformation. Okay, so I'll stop there and take questions.